Ready to dive in, I guess?
Yeah, let's do it. And if you're new to us, we start out each of these Critical Role episodes with a recap because long form content can get lost in it sometimes. So we like to provide a little bit of a refresh for everyone, and we actually upload the recap separately and host that on YouTube. So if you happen to be watching that and you're interested in Blake and I's full discussion, theory crafting, deep dive, you'll be able to find a link to our full episode down below in the comments. Yeah, I guess without further ado, then let's just jump into this recap of episode 4 of Critical Role. Um, here's what you here's what happened, I think.
Yeah,
All
here's what
right,
happened. Let's talk
here
about
we
it.
go. Here we go. Okay, so the episode picks up right where we left off at the end of episode 3 with Imogen having this dream, and she basically jolts awake from this, immediately calls for Laudna, and Laudna is in tune to what's happening here. She's like, "Was it another dream? Are you okay?"
Yeah.
And Imogen's like, "It's the same dream that I've been having, but I saw somebody this time." And she's like, "I think it was Bertrand, and he disappeared into the storm." And she's very upset by this and can't return to sleep. And her and Lada eventually decide, like, okay, let's get up, let's go look for Bertrand and see if we can figure out what's going on here. So they grab their coats, and again, as a reminder, they're staying at the windowed wall. They weren't at the tavern where most of the party is staying. So they put on their coats and head back to the tavern to see if they can find Bertrand there. So they arrive and at the Spire by Fire, and it's pretty dead. But they realize they don't know what room Bertrand was even staying in. So they go up to the bartender and ask him, can you tell us what room Mr. Bell was in? And he won't, violate the privacy of his
Right.
patrons that way, so he won't tell them. So they try to bargain with them, but he's not budging. So they just start yelling for Bertrand. They run upstairs and they just start knocking on doors, trying to figure out where
Yeah.
he is and if they can find him. And they're not having any luck. They just keep knocking on
Yeah.
complete strangers' doors.
Liam O'Brien makes the joke of, get all of your NPCs ready because it's almost like every door it's like a new NPC.
Yeah,
Hi. Yeah.
keeping Matt on his toes.
Yeah.
But so ultimately they do get to Orum's door because they are staying there as well. And he pokes his head out and is like, "Hey, what's going on?" And really quickly, Orem, Fern, and Dorian are kind of brought up to speed on what is happening. That Imogen has had this dream, and she's really worried about Bertrand. And so Dorian's like, I was with him last night. He really wanted to go on this walk. I tried to stop him, but he was insistent, and so he actually was going to walk to find you guys at the windowed wall. And they're like, okay. And Orum's like, his room's like 2 doors down. Let's just go check. And so they do. It's locked. So Orum just fighter slices the door open. They go inside, and he's not there, and they can tell that he hasn't been here. Um, so now everyone's really starting to panic. Dorian, especially, since he was the last one that had seen Belle, and so he's like, "Let's go!" Like he walks downstairs and is like, let's go look for him." And so they decide to kind of retrace their steps back toward the windowed wall, since that was where they think he was going. And the group's basically making perception checks. Orem rolls really highly and unfortunately is able to find the body of their friend down a dark alleyway. And, he goes up and inspects it, and it is Bell, and unfortunately, he is dead. Um, he just starts looking around trying to piece together what happens, and they do quickly realize that he has the same wounds that Orem himself has, which were from that dwarf that they fought the previous night. So seemingly he hunted Bell down and took him out in this alleyway. So basically the party is sitting here not trying to figure out what to do now, and they ultimately decide, all right, let's get his body, let's take him to Esteros's, because Esteros is the only like connection that we know Bell has. So they decide to take the body there. Um, Again, it's like the middle of the night right now. I think Matt mentioned that it was maybe a few hours before
Right.
sunrise. So it's the dead of night. They arrive at Esteros's. Evelyn answers the door, sees what's going on, and she's like, "Okay, I'll go get him." So they wait, and it's mentioned that the house seems like a haunted house. It's like dark and spooky, but It is the middle of the night, so who knows what to read into there. We might talk about it later. Um,
Easy, Chewy.
but so
My man loves
Esteros
his lore.
Esteros eventually comes down and they fill him in. You know, he gives his condolences, apologizes for their loss, and you know, they're all worried that they might be next because seemingly they think that Belle's death is in retribution for what they just this mission they did for Esteros. And you know, Esteros is like, well, what enemies does Belle have? And they're like, no, I think, what enemies do you have? Because we think this is related to you. And he's like, trust me, like my enemies, I have a lot of them, but they're smart and cunning. They would not try to get at me through Bertrand Bell.
Right.
Um, and so they're like, okay, so everyone's trying to like piece this together. And
It was interesting. Well, I mean, we'll talk about it later. How he
yeah,
kept redirecting it back to Bertrand.
right.
Orem wasn't having it, but
Yeah.
anyway, keep going. We'll,
And
we'll talk about
we will.
Yeah,
And so
we'll get
he's
into it.
like, you know, I'll put out my feelers, put out my contacts, see what I can find here. But in the meantime, y'all all need to be safe. And they're like, yeah, can we actually just stay here for the night? And he's like, yeah, I'll need to prepare a room, but you know, that's fine. You can stay here. And so while he goes and prepares the room for them, Fern asks Imogen about her dream a little more and asks like, you know, just more about it. And Imogen reveals that yeah, like she has this dream all the time, and she's always in her hometown.
Mhm.
Um, and the storm always comes, but this time is the first time she's ever seen anyone else in the dream, i.e., Bertrand. It's usually just
Right.
herself. And she also reveals that she believes it's her mother's voice that she hears warning her, like telling her to run back away from the storm. And she thinks it, you know, could possibly be her mom from another realm or something.
Right.
Lot of mystery there that doesn't really get answered, but we do get that at least. And while this is happening, the party hears this coming from above, and all these swords start protruding through the ceiling, and they don't know if they're being attacked or what's happening. But then Estros yells, "Sorry, just clearing the room." So clearly, he's got this place booby trapped
Right.
to the high nines, and is just making sure it's safe before he offers them the room, which he does. And so then the party goes to rest. Meanwhile, back at the Crook House, because Ashton and FCG were not staying at this inn that everyone else was. So they have been absent from all of these happenings in the middle of the night because they were unaware to what was going on. So Ashton is actually poked awake by Annie, and she's just kind of bothering him. And she's like, "Hey, have you found any work?" And Ashton says, "Yeah." And they actually throw her 100 gold and say, you know, it's good work actually. And they kind of ask how the rehearsals are going. And she says, fine, you know, but I do my best when no one's watching. And FCG is like, well, you can practice in front of us every time. And I love that he was just trying to like kind of poke Matt in that moment.
Yeah.
Um, but she's like, no, people got to pay to see me work. And Ashton's like, I'll gladly pay to be able to criticize you.
Yeah.
Um, it's just kind of like a fun character moment. But anyway, they decide that, all right, well, you know, let's go get breakfast sandwiches for everybody and then we'll meet up like we were supposed to do. So they do just that. And there's a funny line that he says that I'm going to get everyone except Bertrand because he can buy his own.
Yeah.
So
There were a
anyway,
lot of comments you're like, haha,
yes, exactly. So they get the breakfast sandwiches, go into the meeting spot at the vertical gardens. Meanwhile, the rest of the party is waking up at Esteros's and they head to the gardens as well. And they find FCG and Ashton already there waiting for them. And they fill FCG and Ashton in on the events of the night and basically just get everyone caught up to speed in this little scene. The only other little points of interest were Mr. eats Dorian's breakfast sandwich, and then Mr. and Pate de Rolo are introduced, and Mr. gets very jealous. Um, then everyone's like offering Dorian pieces of their sandwich, and he's like, "Why does everyone think I have such a big appetite?" Orem's the one that eats so much, and Orem's like, "That was one time,"
yeah.
and
EXU reference.
yep. And Orem actually gives the rest of his sandwich to Mister as well. But so after everyone's caught up and they've eaten their sandwiches, they're like, "All right, well, what do we do now?" And they decide to head back to the Weary Way Inn where they first encountered that dwarf to see if they could just find out anything else. So they head there and talk to the innkeeper, Kamala the Maven, and they're basically trying to smooth her for information, be like, we really loved it when we stayed here. Can we reserve that same room? And she's like, that room's occupied right now, but you can get it as soon as they leave. And so like, okay, thanks. So they head back outside, except for Imogen, who decides to go upstairs and use her kind of like telepathic abilities to see if she can hear if anyone is indeed in that room. Um, when she comes to find that there's not, it's empty. So she tries the door, it's unlocked. And so she goes in and she sees that the room is basically in the same exact state that it was when they left it from their battle. So she strolls out to the balcony and can see everyone else that's waiting outside. And she's like, hey, no one's in here. Come on up. And everyone uses kind of like a different way to jump up to the balcony and join her in there. And so they're just investigating this room again, seeing if they can find anything new. And they return to that hole that they found previously. And Orem is basically the only one that can kind of fit in there and see what's going on. And he kind of gets between the walls and finds out that there's like this shaft that continues down. Again, he's the only one that can fit. And so ultimately decides that, all right, let's see where this goes. And it's where those shade creepers came out originally. And before he decides to go in there, Laudna gives him like a rock chisel in case he needs it, and FCG gives Orem the coin of delving, which is this like magical rock that emits a light, and when you toss it, it kind of like can ping and alert the user to like how far away it was when it finally landed.
This is an important item that we'll find out.
Yes. Stay tuned.
So good.
And so Fern, before he goes, Fern's like, well, I'm going to turn into a snake and go with you so you don't have to go alone. And so the two of them
She
go
has
in.
blind sight too.
Oh,
So.
yes. Right. Yeah. Because it's dark in there. And so they go in, start crawling down this path, and they're telepathically communicating with Imogen while this is happening via her ability. And Ashton actually has tied a rope around Orem, so he has like an anchor as well. They eventually come to a spot where it's just like a straight down like vertical drop, and so they start slowly going down there and just going and going, and they're like, gosh, like how far is this? And so he takes the coin of delving that FCG gave him and tosses it down and is just waiting and waiting and waiting, and after like 30 seconds it finally pings, and they're alerted to the fact that it goes some 1,200 feet down. And so they're blown away by this, and he relays this information back to Imogen, and they're like, yeah, I mean, I guess hoist us back up because we're clearly not going 1,200 feet down here. So they get pulled back up, tell everyone what happens, and Orm's like, hey, yeah, FCG, sorry, I lost your coin. And FCG is like, oh, it's fine.
Yeah. He's like, what?
Yeah.
He's like, what?
And you can tell he's like upset by it, but he's like not saying that. He's like, it's fine. Like, I don't care. It's not like it was given to me by my dead friend Dancer.
Yeah,
and Orem's like, oh my gosh, like I feel so bad. And he's like, oh please, like I'm so sorry, I didn't know. And he's like, yeah, no worries. And Laudna's like, what happened to Dancer? And FCG says that she was eviscerated by an unknown monster. And Norm's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, please let me pay for it. And FCG's like, I don't like money. I don't take money. And so Orem's like, here, Ashton, please hold on to this money for FCG. So Orem gives 200 gold to Ashton because he feels so bad. But then the whole party is just basically talking about like, what the hell does this 1,200 foot drop mean? They're talking about like, how big are the spires? Like, do they mine stuff here? Like, what could this possibly be? And they don't really have any good ideas for what it could be. So they kind of put that on pause for now. And then they turn back to, okay, let's investigate this room. How did this dwarf get out of here that night? Because he was too big to fit in the shaft. And so they're like, perhaps he went onto the roof. And so the party kind of splits. Half of them are like, we'll check the roof. The rest are going back to the street. And do you want to take over from there?
Yeah, dude. I love listening to your recap. I'm just like reliving it. I'm like, yes, that's such a good part. So they're kind of at a dead end, and they're like, okay, let's just figure out where the dwarf went. So some go up to the roof, some go down back outside of the tavern. And on the roof, it's pretty not really much there, except they do notice where the simurgs, like the this wolf head bird that's native to the region, We've seen its bird poop on other rooftops, and
Yeah.
they do see this on the roof, and they see what appears to be dwarven footprints, as if someone had like launched themselves off of the roof. And they take this to realize basically that the dwarf must have escaped via the roof at some point. So they yell that down to the people down below, and they're kind of like, okay, well, that's not really helpful. And so they all go back down and they're about to leave when someone's like, I think it's FCG is like, well, someone must have rented the room. Like, why don't we ask, is it Kamala? Is that
Kamala,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Let's ask Kamala if they know who rented it. And so they're all thinking of these great ideas. Like, well, how can we figure this out? And then Ashton is like, doesn't like a bribe work? Like, and it kind of threw me back to a previous episode where he's like, does anyone crime here? Like, why are we making this
Yeah.
so difficult? So he goes in and asks basically who owned the room, and Kamal's like, I don't know, and basically bribes him 10 gold and like slides it, across. I think like in a not very subtle way, just
Yeah.
slides it. And Kamala basically is like, yeah, on the promise that Ashton will make sure this kind of trouble doesn't happen again in terms of like beating up the room. He's like, yeah, it was a dwarf named Duggar, and Duggar's been renting the room on and off for about a month now. And so he's like, okay, great. Thanks for telling me that. So he comes out, and Ashton's very excited, almost like it's his first time doing this, which you wouldn't expect of this character. And he shares the information with the rest of the group that it's a dwarf named Duggar. And that's basically all they know. Well, Laudna's like, well, why don't we, on the way back to Esteros, why don't we stop at other taverns to see if he had like another room that he's been like bouncing around, which I thought was a great idea.
Yeah.
The only tavern that is on the way is Spire by Fire. So they dip into there, and you get this great scene where Dorian, they're like, hey, Dorian, you probably know how to handle taverns. And he's like, why would I know that? And which we'll talk about later.
Yep.
But he's like, okay, yeah. So he has this great moment where he just kind of yells out loud. He's like, oh, Duggar, you old dog, you jilted me again. And like kind of like looks around to see if anyone notices. And he does notice a tiefling in the corner who like looks up, notices the name, and then quickly is like, oh, yeah, I don't know who that is.
Yeah.
He goes and sits down with the tiefling, and he's like, hi, do you, hi, I'm new here. And can I have some small talk? And tiefling's like, what's going on? And basically says, hey, I was gambling with someone and they took off with my bet. I'm new here. That's not cool. Do you know a guy named Duggar by chance? And the tiefling is like, yeah. I think the tiefling's name is Janaya.
Mm-hmm.
And Janaya's like, yeah, I do know Duggar. Duggar's been around here for a long time. Used to be a carpenter. And I think it was something like 6 months ago, shop closed down, but Duggar continued to seem to have money, meaning that he was likely into some shady deals.
Right.
Janaya also points out that Duggar has never been this creepy before, but that he's really just been wasting away, that he's possibly on something or doing something. And also in this conversation, Janaya's getting to be really suspicious of who is this person. And at one point, Dorian actually puts his hand on Janaya's hand and casts Charm Person. And then Janaya is like, it's just this great scene with Matt Mercer where, he's kind of flirting back with Dorian. And it's just such a great scene. And the one line I just have to mention in the recap is Dorian's trying to break away. And he's like, hey, are you empty? Do you need a refill? And he's like, oh, yeah, fill me up. And it was just a great, like, on the nose line. And then when they're leaving, Janaya's like, where are you going? Come back. It was just great.
Yeah.
So anyway, they make their way with this information back to Esteros. And I can't remember if it was Janaya or Esteros who mentioned the Hubat Corsairs. I think it was Janaya originally, right?
I think they both, yeah. Janaya did, but they both talked about it, yeah.
Yeah, so Janaya originally had said that Duggar had got himself in with the Hubat Corsairs, which is another like shady dealing type of organization similar to the Ivory Syndicate. And actually, when they go back to Esteros, they see Bertrand, his body's kind of laid out still, almost kind of like in a visitation room kind of way is kind of what I envision.
Mm-hmm.
And they share this information with Esteros, who basically says, yeah, the Hubat Corsairs are kind of like a Robin Hood-esque, rob from the rich, give to the poor. They're always in conflict with the Ivory Syndicate. They don't hurt people, whereas the Ivory Syndicate is quite brutal. and basically paints this as a very almost like noble-esque
Yeah.
moral code type of organization.
They have a better reputation for sure, like
Yeah.
in the streets.
And Dorian's like, well, that doesn't make sense because Duggar killed our friend.
Right,
So,
right.
and so Esteros is like, well, it could be that that's just their reputation that they've like carefully curated, but
Yeah.
that actually that's not who they really are. But he does mention, hey, I have been wanting to get in with them. So if you come across them, basically let me know. And
Put in a good word.
I'd like to have a more formal relationship with them.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like random conversations that happen. Fern asks questions about like Broomstone. Is it found here? And Esteros basically says, no, that's carefully taken care of by another group far away from here. Even I don't know where it's kept. He does name one of the other spires, the Smolder Spire, which is where there's a lot of mining that happens. And Fern asks, is there any Broomstone here? Or like, do they mine it here? And he's like, no. And Fern does an insight check, rolls high, and gets a very long whisper from Matt Mercer about this conversation. We don't know what it is.
Ooh.
So they continue to have the conversation. They ultimately decide, okay, let's try to follow this arc of the Hubat Corsairs. And they have a moment where they decide that they want to say their goodbye to Bertrand, and each of them does. And it's actually a fairly sweet moment combined with some pretty funny comments. Like Fern mentions, hey, I know you hated jazz, and I hope wherever you went that you end up liking it. So, stuff like that. But they also have this conversation with Esteros on where to send the body. And they eventually basically say, yeah, maybe send it to Whitestone because of the Vox Machina lapel that's on his shirt.
Right.
They're like, should we send him to Zephyra? Should we send him to Whitestone? And basically Esteros reveals that he does have an airship and that he can basically send Bertrand.
Baller, by the way.
Yeah, this dude is filthy rich, obviously. Says, yeah, we'll send him to Whitestone. So they decide that. The group decides to head to the Crook House because they realize that Esteros basically says that the Hubat Corsairs are known in the Elder Post, which is like this underground market, and that they have a reputation in the Hollow and where the Crook House is, basically this underbelly of the spires. And so they decide to head that way, but not before Orem, one-to-one with Esteros, reveals more about his mission. He says, basically, do you know Rashad Breggio? I'm looking for him. There was an attack on a family back in Tal'Dorei, similar to an attack here. And in this conversation with Esteros, Esteros basically says, yeah, Breggio, also known as the Anger, was wounded. He's recovering ever since there was an attack on the Loomis family locally. And so this is apparently some kind of royal or noble family attack that's very similar to something that happened in Tal'Dorei. We're not really sure what.
Yeah,
but
in Zephyra, I think, specifically.
Oh, okay, in Zephyra. Mm-hmm. And Esteros basically says, well, you keep doing work for me, and in just a little while, I'll make an introduction for you, is basically what he says. Party heads to the Crook House. They meet Milo, who's wearing like these very big goggles that accentuate his eyes or their eyes. And I envision like a from The Incredibles, like the no capes person. Like
yeah, that's who I thought of too.
And Milo's kind of tinkering with some stuff, and Lauden is actually very impressed with this and is like, look, I have my own thing that I've tinkered with, and shows Pate de Rolo, who Milo absolutely adores, and is like, I could do that. I could make that. Lauden makes an interesting detail where she says, oh, it can only go 6 inches from me for now. So be interesting what that means. We'll talk more about that. And Ashton basically says like, hey, we're trying to find the Hubat Corsairs. Do you have any ideas, any leads? And Milo basically says, yeah, you could go ask Advik. And he's like, oh, I don't want to go talk to Advik.
Not Advik.
And he's like, who's Advik? And he's like, oh man, Advik, I have a debt with him. And he says, or you can go talk to Ephid. And he's like, oh no, I can't do that. There's a lot of names get thrown around here. And they ultimately decide, okay, let's go talk to Advik, coincidentally down in the Elder Post. They go down the Elder Post. It's deep in the underbelly of the Lantern Spire. And again, it's like this underground marketplace, basically, like envision like tunnels underground with like booths set up, merchants, things like that. And they come across this gentleman, this very shady fellow, who's like, have a look at my wares. And this is Ephrid, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
A lot of E
Ephraim.
names. I think it's
Yeah.
Ephred, the Shadow
The
Baker.
Shadow
He has
Baker.
he has this trench coat esque, portrayal of all of these baked goods, and party ends up buying them. They're like, "Oh my gosh, you're delicious, you're amazing." And what ends up happening is Ashton decides to bribe him to tell him about the Hubot Corsairs, and basically says, we're in bad with this guy named Duggar. He makes a roll that doesn't seem like a very good roll, and he also bribes 5 gold. And uh, the Shadow Baker says basically, yeah, you need to head over to the Root. Was it the Root Trader Alcove?
Yes.
Which is nearby, and says, tell them you've come for the laughter, and that will set you on your way to like where you're trying to go. And they're like, okay, great. Thank you. That was really helpful.
Yeah.
So they head to this area,
And
and
Imogen
yeah,
was like probing his mind during this whole where they're trying to get information out of him. She also did her mind tricks to kind of like read his mind.
and it seems like he's aware of this too,
Yeah.
which we'll talk more about that in our description of this episode. But so they go to this alcove, and there's 2 people. There's a dragonborn and a what was the name? I think of like Arakoa, but it wasn't that. It was a different. It was like a bird-like race.
Yeah, I have this written down somewhere.
Well, the bird-like creature's name is heron, and
Mm. Oh,
basically they're
Usfura or something.
okay.
I'm saying it wrong, but
Well, so they get there and they kind of like awkwardly like, we're here for the laughter, and they're
yeah.
like, okay. So they show this door behind like some clothing, because this is kind of like a trader area, and I think of like the rolling cart of like coats, and they kind of move that aside. There's a door. They go up this spiral narrow staircase to a latch that they open. One by one they climb out, and they're in this incredibly dark storage room. Dorian lights his scimitar. Laudna has dark vision, and they realize that on the edge of this space are all of these people who were just standing there staring at them. And Heron
Neat.
basically says, these people have come for the laughter. And there's this like cacophony of chuckles and laughters among the crowd. And then this one roguish like character steps out and has a sword, a scimitar in his hand, and says, today, friends, is not your luckiest of days. And it seems like they've walked into some kind of trap. And that is what happened on episode 4 of Critical Role, campaign 3.
Well done.